Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of whether, and if so, how, politics should appear in our preaching this week. My name is Lee Liddell and I'm a minister in the United Reformed Church, where I am currently serving in an ecumenical setting in Cardiff. And this week is a little different. It is the last in the series of Politics in the Pulpit for this year. And so this episode is our handover episode, where I am going to hand over the reins to Geoffrey Farrar. Geoffrey is a Methodist minister in Putney in southwest London. Before he was ordained, he served for 10 years in the House of Commons as a clerk, one of the permanent secretariat at Parliament. He worked with select committees and in the legislation service and was able to see how politics affected every area of our society. He is committed to connecting how we pray, read our scripture, to how we vote and live. And so, Geoffrey, welcome for your first episode.
Thank you.
Do you want to tell us a bit more, expand a bit more on that? It sounds like you've had such an interesting run up into ministry, how you came into ministry from that job.
Yeah, so I was 10 years at Parliament and nobody ever understood what I did, including my own mother, bless her. So I was what's called a clerk, and interestingly, clerk and cleric come from the same root. It means somebody who can read and write. And when Parliament started back in the 14th century, they worked out pretty soon that they needed people who could read and write, because a lot of people, including a lot of members of Parliament, couldn't. And so the jobs of the clerk was to make Parliament work. And we still get a sense of that in our way we talk about legislation today, by having readings of bills. So talk about first reading, second reading, third reading. And that comes from the fact that literally the clerk would have to read out what was being said, because some people couldn't read it, couldn't understand it. So clerks they don't work for a particular party. We're not researchers. That was, people often said, oh, do you work for an MP, or do you do? No, we worked for all MPs. And the best way of describing it, they're the people who sit in front of the speaker. If you see the boss, the head clerks, they sit in front of the speaker, and they're the ones, when things are going wrong, they'll lean back and whisper things to the speaker. And they're the sort of the memory of Parliament. They advise on precedent. They advise on how things should be done. And it was a really fascinating job, and it was a great insight into how politics. I always said it was like we were in politics without being in politics. So we worked very closely with MPs and ministers and others, but we were never tied to a particular party. We didn't have to abide by a particular doctrine.
Oh, okay. That sounds really interesting.
So, and I think there were certainly some transferable skills to ministry in terms of being diplomatic and knowing when to speak and when keep silent. And I was very privileged in what I saw, and I was there during days leading up to the Iraq War, and Foreign Affairs Committee then, and the aftermath of that war, and the aftermath of Afghanistan, leading into the MP's expenses crisis, then leading into the financial crisis. So we saw some interesting things. I think my colleagues who stayed in have seen even more interesting days since, with the especially this year with the revolving door of prime ministers.
Yeah, absolutely. And so how did you go from that job into a call to ministry?
Well, I'm a cradle Methodist, as they say, or cradle Christian, and I grew up in a Methodist church, in a church-going family, and I'd always been closely connected. And we were just talking before now. I went to Cardiff University, and I was part of an excellent METSOC there. And I've always been a member of a church. And latterly, I had felt a call to serve, and I felt within our ministry we have a call to local preaching, to lay preaching, so I was able to continue my job and preach as well, and train to be a preacher. But then I did feel that, like many of us, we talk about an itch you can't scratch.
Yeah.
And I thought this is, I feel this thing that I'm doing in my spare time is more important than what I'm doing in my day job sometimes, and the crucial word vocation. I felt really called. I felt that these were my callings, that the things that I was being called to do on Sunday in leading worship, that was the groove I fitted.
Yeah.
And it was hard. It was very hard leaving that world, and that the world of Westminster is a bubble. It is a very, it is its own little world within a world. But I felt that, looking back, that I have been better prepared for ministry by coming through that path than if I'd just gone straight in.
Yeah. That's something of having that life experience before going into ministerial training kind of full time, I think is really helpful.
Yeah.
And so it seems a fairly nonsensical question.
Sorry, I just got the postman. Yeah. Okay, great. It's my we just saying it's my son's birthday today, so the postmen are going berserk and delivering packages.
So it feels a little bit kind of a nonsensical question, but politics in the pulpit, what does that mean for you then? I guess, is it after having that kind of training and experience and lived kind of employment there, does that feel louder for you, do you think? Or do you think you've created distance from it, from being straddling kind of both worlds, really?
I think it's given me both a sense of perspective and a sense of the importance of politics.
Yeah.
I have to be careful. There's that I'm sure it's been discussed on this program before, the idea of having the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other.
Yes.
I am passionate about that. That I get some kickback from that. Some congregations say, all we want is the Bible, all we want is the word.
Yes.
And and sometimes you have to go with that, and you have to be careful. But we are people in the world. We are called to be salt in the world. And whether we like it or not, we are in that world. And my 10 years in politics, my experiences subsequently, have shown me that politics affects every aspect of our life. And we cannot separate it. And when we do separate it, when people say politics is something that happens over there, it's all about political parties. I'm not political, as I'm sure we've all heard. That sort of gets my goat, because it's not true. Because the minute you step outside your house, the postman coming to the door, the fact that he works for a privatized company now is a political decision. I go out of my door, the parking, the whether the leaves are collected, my son's school, everything is determined by politics. And we as Christians have got to be present in that world. And sort of another sort of strand to my life, a latter strand to my life, is that I'm doing a very, very part-time PhD at the University of Roehampton, which is about 10 minutes from here, with a good Southlands College, which is part of the university's good connection to the Methodist Church, Methodist Foundation. And I'm doing my PhD on around the area of the books of the Maccabees, the intertestamental.
Okay.
And you see how the world of politics didn't begin in the 20th century with parliamentary, with the emancipation of women or anything like that. Politics has been present throughout history. Politics determined the world into which Jesus was born. And I always say this, Jesus dealt with politicians every day. And they had funny names like ethnarch or high priest or kings or whatever, but they were politicians. And I always say politicians nailed Jesus to a cross because they didn't want to listen to the things he said. So our scriptures are witnessing to God, a God who is present in the world, a God who's immanent, a God who is incarnate. And that means dealing with politics, whether we like it or not.
No, absolutely. If not, we're in danger of, as churches, to kind of becoming even more distanced from the public square and from society, and understanding where people are and the decisions that affect their lives. And I think that we've become distant through not kind of acknowledging the fact that all of this is one, that we are all affected differently, but we are all affected by political structures that determine in some cases, you know, what we've got and what we haven't got. And when life is at that level, then it's our responsibility to be able to speak into that, or at least offer faith into that space, rather than keeping them very separate, keeping it a kind of Sunday morning faith, which arguably I think church models there's a sense in trying to hold on to it because there was high numbers and things when church was kind of just a bigger part of our society. But then arguably it's dropped out of society because it's not been part of our society all at the same time. And it's finding that tension, I think, between being able to speak into these things, but also being able to offer hope into these things where perhaps hope is difficult to find in other realms, such as that, you know, the Houses of Parliament and things like that. It's not felt like a place of hope or a beacon of hope, has it, for this last certainly 12 months, and, you know, I dare say before that. But it's a really, I think, interesting and unique role that we play in this.
I think the key word you said there is tension. Because we have to maintain, we have to be, as Christ said, you know, salt in the world cannot lose its saltiness.
Yes.
And one thing I often reflect upon is the history of within my own tradition, the Methodist tradition. And famously, it was said that the Labour Party owed more to Methodism than Marxism. And within the Methodist movement, we would say, gave birth to the trade union movement and helped birth the Labour Party. And within Methodist, what we could see happening, especially the late 19th century, early 20th century, was some people who were supremely motivated by that call to change the world in the Gospels. They went into the trade union movement and into the Labour Party, and some of them abandoned their faith pretty much, because they said the way of salvation, the way to make the world better, is through political action. And that led to a reaction from the evangelical movement, we say, who said, right, we're having nothing to do with politics because it just leads people away from God. And you're saying that salvation lies through Marxism, through revolution, through political power. And we're not having anything to do with that. And that led to that disconnection, you might say. And it's only really recently, and this is why I think within the Christian tradition, you have people who are very reluctant for us to be engaged with politics because they've seen what happens. They say, well, it just takes people away from Christ. It's as bad as mammon. It takes people away because it says there's another solution. And I feel that tension within myself, because sometimes I say, oh, throw away the pulpit and all the rest of it. Let's march onto the streets and get some change going. But it's about that tension, as you said, about bringing Christ to the world and the world to Christ.
Yeah, absolutely right. And as you alluded to earlier, about your passion for bringing the things that are going on around us into our pulpits. Our JPIT colleagues each week give us a roundup of their expertise and what they think we ought to be keeping an eye on in the world this week. And so some of the key issues that are happening around us this week, the COP27 ended with some progress on loss and damage, but without, again, a clear way forward on emissions. And the JPIT have released a statement on that yesterday, which is up on their website for people to look at. The fallout from the budget about how people will still be concerned about rising living costs. And the Football World Cup has started in the midst of a lot of controversy over human rights violations, which seem to be kind of picking up the headlines more than what's happening on the pitch at the moment. I know last night in the Wales game, there were a few people who had tried to get in with kind of a rainbow on their tops and had been asked to leave and told that they were not allowed to enter the stadium with that. And so it's a very altogether different sense of World Cup and I guess what football does in uniting people. It seems to be a very different prospect with this World Cup. We also have our church dates. It is this week and is the beginning of Advent. We also have Prisoners' Week in Scotland, and it is the 16 days of activism against gender violence, which begins on the 25th of November until the 10th of December. And so with all of this, Geoffrey, with our metaphorical newspapers in one hand and our Bibles in the other, I wonder if there is a particular passage or a theme or a question that's jumped out from the readings this week where you'd like us to begin?
Yeah, I mean, there's not much to talk about, is there? I think reflecting on the readings, yes, and we're recording this late because of my diary just went pear-shaped yesterday. I think the word that is coming to my mind is time. It's time. Okay. And time in lots of different ways. Advent, of course, is a season that is about time. It's about, as what we often think is a countdown.
Yeah.
Season. It's a time of when we all begin to get a little bit more stressed in the world because we're thinking, oh, we've got so much time to get presents and time to organise this. For clergy, I always think this part is the absolute worst part of the year because there is just not enough time to do everything, to prepare all the services, and you're constantly looking ahead, thinking, right, how are we going to manage this? How and how are we going to get all these services in? And our readings this week are very much about times, several of them, and about that. So we have in the Romans reading, besides, you know what time it is, how it is now the moment for you to wake from sleep. And in the Matthew, the gospel reading, but about that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels nor heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. And on Sunday evening, like many other churches, we've got our churches together, carol service, and we'll be having the readings like the parable of the bridesmaids, all the rest of it. So it's all about time. And within the season of Advent, within the readings, there is this timelessness to the stories. We're telling stories that people are deeply familiar with, ancient stories about shepherds and wise men, about prophets, thousands of years, hundreds of years before that. There's this God's time, but there's also this, now is the time. Be ready now. And especially Paul, always, of course, being insistent, you must be ready now, be prepared now. So you've got all this time stuff. And then within the political sphere, we've got the challenge of time. And I just looked up before, because I had to remember who said it, but it was Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, who said, a week is a long time in politics.
Yeah.
And we've got the issues around the budget and everything else. And when I was in Parliament, I saw repeatedly, and you can see it constantly, how the challenge is to deal with the present moment. And people want answers now, and they want solutions now.
Yeah.
And you've got to get it by, there are key moments in the day. So you might get the 1 o'clock news, you get the 6 o'clock news. And at present, things are even worse with the rolling news agenda. So people constantly, you've got to have answers now.
Yeah.
And repeatedly, politicians make short-term decisions because that is what people arguably want. We've got to have a solution now.
Yeah.
And what the budget in particular, the last budget, has done unashamedly, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, has said, right, we're going to push these tax rises into a couple of years' time, coincidentally after the next election.
Yeah.
By chance. We're going to push some of those tough decisions into the future. And we're going to try and get some things now. But the challenges we are facing nationally and especially internationally with the COP stuff are huge long-term problems. And if we separate the two, so some of the problems we are facing now as a nation, especially about energy, are because of we have to be honest, are because of political failure. Got problems with Putin, we all know about that.
Yeah.
But the decisions to not invest in energy.
Yeah.
And why? Because it's such a long-term thing. Because if you're a politician now, you say, right, we're going to build a power station, we're going to build lots of wind turbines, whatever. You will see those benefits in a decade. Now, you may not be in Parliament by then, and it's certainly not going to, and you're going to annoy a great deal of people first, because of course you have to spend the money, raise taxes, you have to build pylons, so you annoy lots of people in the short term for a thing that you will never see the benefit of.
Yeah.
And COP brings that even more into focus, because these are huge long-term problems that we have known about for years and decades. We have tried to hide them. And again, dealing with those problems, saying to people, as I forget who said it now, but we must live more simply so others may simply live.
Yeah.
You're saying you have got to stop doing some of the things you like for this future decision. So that's a huge thing, but it's all about about time, and about what the challenges of dealing with
and the power that time has over us. As you were talking about, and I understand completely about making political decisions now that have a long-term impact. And if we're honest, one party doesn't want to give another party any advantage because they don't want to give up any of their power. So what they don't want to do is make an investment that might give the other political party, who may be in power, an advantage over them. It's so difficult because actually we talk, and I think one thing that the COP crisis, the energy crisis has brought, and COP has into our imaginations, is that we've got to work with that power of time, that humanity is more important than the power of party politics.
Yeah.
But then we live in this now completely 24-hour society where people want answers now. I don't think we ever would have 10 years ago seen a prime minister being forced to go in the way that Liz Truss was, if there wasn't that constant tension being put upon her. And I think you can actually see some of that tension come out in the Romans reading, and with Paul's sense of salvation is just round the corner. You know, Christ is coming back now, so be ready now. And it's really hard to fit it's back to that word, that tension of sitting with something that is both long term, but with an immediacy question mark around it, and holding those two things in tension in both our society, in our faith, and within ourselves, because we all change and adapt, don't we? I couldn't have imagined something like buying something on Amazon in the morning to get it in the evening. Could you imagine that 10 years ago? You'd have to wait 6 months for a video to come out, you know, between cinema release and video. But now that's what we expect now. It's where we are, isn't it? We all change, and we all change our kind of what we feel our power is in this, that the power is in the now. But yet we enter this time of waiting in Advent, and I always see as this beautiful reminder of the importance of sitting and taking stock and taking that journey every year anew in light of what's going on with you. Because I think Advent, whilst the story's the same, the meaning always changes depending on, you know, how your year's been. I know certainly throughout the pandemic, kind of Advent took on a whole new meaning to lots of people, as did Easter. And I think there's some of that in our readings as well. In Matthew, there's that sense of get ready and live ready, you know. You must be ready, because I don't know when this is going to happen, and you don't know when this is going to happen. And so there's something about a choice there as well, about kind of tackling that tension of the two, of both being ready but also living at the same time.
Yeah. And there's great tension within our faith about living in the moment, but also so to speak, being a faith that is, you know, millennia old, and is looking to the it should be investing and looking toward the future. I mean, I think that sort of the tension about faith and politics. I think one of the roles of Christians in politics is to speak up for those long-term issues and speak against the short-termism that we see in our political life. I mean, we mentioned in your roundup, it's Prisoners Week in Scotland coming up. Putney Methodist Church, we have a strong link with Wandsworth Prison, and one of our members is a former chaplain there. There's a charity that we support that tries to help people transition out of prison, and we pray for prisoners a lot. And we heard about the terrible situation of prisoners in the pandemic. However bad it was for us, it was just horrendous for both prisoners and prison staff, because they were completely locked up. But this is one of those issues where it is our responsibility as Christians to speak up for those who have no voice. And no politician really has any interest in investing in prisons, because it gets you nothing. Nobody out there, you think, nobody really cares. No votes in looking after prisons. And so what we have now is we have incredibly expensive schools for crime. You know, famously, it costs more to send a prisoner to prison than it does to send a child to Eton per year. And we, by failing to invest, by failing to allocate resources, you take low-level criminals who as we all know, who have come from backgrounds that we as ministers are very familiar with, broken homes, addiction, etc., you turn them into confirmed drug addicts usually, and better criminals. And the system just goes round and cycles round and round and round. And we as Christians should be saying, we believe in justice. That's the thing that's usually thrown at us, isn't it? Oh, you just let everybody free. We believe in justice, but we believe in life after death, and we believe in life before death too. And we believe in rehabilitation, and we believe in the chance for a new start. And we believe in investing in people in the long term. If you invest now in this person, eventually there will be hope for them. And I think it's in those issues, and we've talked about environmental issues a lot, but we as Christians should be saying, no, we believe in the long, we believe in a better planet for the next generation and the generation after that, because God has given us this planet. And what I would always say to people is politicians need people like us to speak out. All the voices, all that is heard is those voices of short-termism, of often of anger, and of everything that contradicts Christian values. And because the good do not speak out, because the Christian voices are not heard, we assume that everybody is not interested in that. And we've seen that with the climate situation, where politicians have finally realized that actually a lot of people would support them if they speak out on these issues.
Well, it's become such a toxic prospect, hasn't it, now? If you believe, like, as we've said, in the long-termism, in the finding forgiveness, in the investment of long-term people, you're likely to be called woke or a snowflake or other such terminology that has become part of the public imagination, which makes it incredibly divisive. And almost it is, and less so in this country, but certainly in kind of American politics, what it has turned is America as this faith of its own right, that America is almost this religion, that if you're not investing in being American first, then what you are is a woke liberal snowflake who is kind of rolling over to everybody's whims, as they would say. And always, it's harder to love than it is to hate at times. Much, much harder in our society to invest in love than it is to get swept away in short-term notions of what kind of hate and dislike and morality look like now in our very changed society. And it's interesting, Donald Trump's appeared back on Twitter this week, and so we're heading back into this really toxic snapshots of what it is when people don't get what they want, how they widen the agenda so far. I mean, you could predict it in the midterm elections that if any Republicans lost, that that would have meant that the ballot was illegal or wrong, or but yet if they'd won, there's no such questioning of any kind of, and so we see this kind of flip-flopping back, where it's the pressure is to be in that immediate space of lashing out when your own agenda isn't met. And so I found what you kind of said about investing in the long term and our voices being really important in that, really moving, actually. I think you're absolutely right.
And we have to be very careful in this country. When we see America, that is a prediction of the future. Of how it could
always
be. That and we have seen people in the political sphere, especially those around politicians, the advisors, the people we don't see, they look across the state, across the pond, and they say these things work.
Yeah.
The agenda of hatred, of division, the rhetoric of that works. It gets votes. And if we are not careful, we will go that way. I just want to pick up on one, coming back, if we can, finally, to our readings, because we've got all over. But that word you use, woke, that terrible word, that from Romans. Besides this, you know what time it is, how it is now the moment for you to wake from sleep. And there is so much in the Advent readings about being awake, and in our hymns, in our Advent carols. And I would desperate to preach a sermon on, was Jesus woke? Because in the original meaning of that word, and it's been around apparently for decades, it just means you have woken up to the world around you. And that, there is something central to Jesus's teachings. Remember, saying to the disciples, could you not stay awake in the Garden of Gethsemane? The idea of waking up and seeing the world as it is, and not being, rubbing from your eyes all the deceptions of this world and the lies of the devil and all the rest of it. Jesus was really telling people to wake up.
Yeah.
And within the apocalyptic tradition, we have that idea of pulling back the curtain and saying, this is wake up, this is how the world is, this is what's really happening.
Yeah.
So I would be very controversial and say I think Jesus was probably woke as well.
I mean, looking at Isaiah, good grief, God's woke, they shall beat their swords into plowshares.
Yeah.
And you imagine, how we talk about guns and in America and stuff like that idea of taking your guns and turning them into something peaceful. And I think Isaiah, we hear the wokeness there of God as well.
I wouldn't like to have called Isaiah woke to his face, I don't think, but I think you're right.
But just the idea of turning our weapons into peace, and the spears into pruning hooks, that nations can come together, that God is not there for any kind of particular one, that all the nations shall stream to it, and how that through Advent and through Jesus actually comes to pass is again that both that longevity of how long these things take, and the choices that we must make to be long term with it, to walk those paths long term, and to give up the things that are going on the kind of the cross sections of paths around us. That it is a choice and it is a decision to work for peace, to work towards an earth where people are going to be able to inhabit it for generations to come. These will take choices and long-term dedication to do so.
And I think that idea of peace is something that we talk about so easily and so lightly. It takes a huge amount of work over the long term to build peace.
It does.
And, we look at those moments in history where peace has come about, true peace. It has taken so much sacrifice, so much hard work, and it takes institutions, it takes so much time, and we have to be committed to it over the long term. And but war takes a minute, so to speak, to start.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Geoffrey, thank you so much for joining us, and good luck for the next season, which I think comes out January sometime. It begins, doesn't it? So there's a break now for
big shoes to fill, and thank you, Lee, for guiding us through these last few months. And I hope you've enjoyed the time.
Oh, I've loved it. I've really loved it. But it's kind of, as I've been saying, I've got a master's dissertation to write that now needs my attention.
Come, now is the time.
Now is definitely got to be the time.
The day draws near. And you are nearer to your deadline than when you awoke this morning.
Yes, and the hour of it is definitely known. So thank you so much, Geoffrey. It's been so lovely, and I'll be praying for you.
And have a lovely Christmas when it comes.
Wonderful. Yeah, and you. And to all our listeners, if you have enjoyed this episode of Politics in the Pulpit, please leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode with your friends. We do love to have an ongoing conversation with our listeners about faith and politics. So even though we're on a break, please, we encourage you to still do join in on Twitter with our handle at pulpit_politics, or using the hashtag politics in the pulpit, and on our Facebook community, which you can access through the Joint Public Issues Facebook page and on their website, jointpublicissues.org.uk. And so let's go into both our politics and our pulpits with this blessing. May you be anointed with God's Spirit as you bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Amen.